All right, I asked you if you'd ever seen a fruit or vegetable that you'd never seen before. Most of you have. Now, suppose you have a visitor in your home who comes from some exotic country to this country for the first time. He walks in your dining room where you have a bowl of fruit, and he points to an object in that bowl and he says, "What's that?" And you look at him in utter amazement. You say, "That's an orange." He said, "I've never seen one of those before. What do you use it for?" You say, "It's a fruit. We eat it." He says, "What's it like?" You say, "Wait a minute, I'll show you." So you go in the kitchen and get a knife and come back and slice the orange and open it up and show it to him. Now what he sees when you show him the orange is a circle with a white seam down the middle and two segments on either side, right? Now just about that time, your roommate, spouse, or whoever else occupies your facility with you, enters the room and characteristically says, "What are you doing?" And you explain that your visitor has never seen an orange before, so you're trying to show him what it is. And characteristically, your spouse or roommate says, "Why don't you slice it the other way?" Now, your typical response is, "What the hell difference does it make?" But then if you stop and reflect for a moment, you might say, "Hey, that's a good idea." So you get the knife again, and you either put the orange back together again and slice it the other way, or take a fresh one. And you slice it the other way, and what you now see is something that looks like this. Now those two are exactly the same object, but they're two entirely different views of it. Now what Singer observed is we had been assuming that the universe could only be sliced one way, cause and effect. He said, in fact, there are an infinite number of ways of slicing it. Producer product is another way. But there are many others as well. Now, if you really want to know what the structure of an orange is, how many ways ought you to slice it? Well, every conceivable way. So he devoted his life to slicing it the other way to see what would happen. All right, now remember, a producer is necessary but not sufficient for the effect. A mother is a producer of a child, not the cause of a child. Because despite women's libs, she's only necessary, not sufficient. The same is equally true of a father. All right. What happens to the first thing, environment free? We want to explain that oak. We look back in history and we can identify the acorn from which that oak grew. Do we have a complete explanation of the oak? No. Why? Because the acorn was not sufficient. To get a complete explanation, we have to know all the other necessary conditions, which together with the acorn is the cause of the oak. Now, what are the other necessary conditions? The environment. Lo and behold, you now need the environment to explain everything. You can't explain anything without the environment. Furthermore, there is no such thing as a universal law. Laws are always relevant to a particular environment, and there's always some other environment in which they won't hold. This has been one of the great shocks that's been occurring in science in the last couple decades. For example, as a child, I was taught that the most immutable law of nature is that everything that goes up must come down, right? Well, hell, we're putting things up all the time that don't come down anymore. Occasionally, one of them does. It's not supposed to, but in general, we know how to get things up there that won't come down. In fact, we even raised the question about what up and down means. Everything becomes environmentally relevant. We developed whole new concepts of experimentation, the result of the work of R.A. Fisher in England, in which we don't do experiments in a laboratory anymore and systemic work. It's done in the real world with multiple variables and the environment taken into account, not excluded but brought in. But that's a whole topic that we don't have time to explore in any detail here. So we get an environment-full theory of explanation. First cause, we saw what happened to that. You get a different concept of God. God as the whole, rather than God as a part from the universe and its creator. And what happened to determinism? Well, that's the most complex part of Singer's work, but what he demonstrated is that when the world is looked at from the point of view of producer-product, choice and free will is completely compatible with it, and furthermore can be objectively studied, just like weight and speed and other physical characteristics of a person. And that doctrine is called teleology, or purposefulness. Now, if you take teleology together with environment full, with producer-product, expansionism, and put it all together, what's the view of the universe that begins to emerge? No longer that of a machine, but the universe is seen as a system, but a particular kind of a system, a purposeful system. We see things now as systems. And systems have parts. And every system is contained in a larger system. Because remember, we can't prove that there's one system that contains everything. Because if there is, we'll never find it. Now, these are sometimes referred to as the supra-system. In common English, that's the environment. The system and the subsystems. Now, the two important things that emerge from starting to look at things this way. First of all, there are three kinds of systems. There's a system which has no purpose, a purposeless system. They exist. And if the system has no choice, its parts can have. You can have a system which doesn't have choice, whose parts do. What do you call such a system? A system that has no choice. That's what a machine is. That's precisely what a machine is. It's a purposeless machine, a purposeless system. A machine serves the purposes of a containing system. The automobile has no purpose of its own, but it serves your purposes. You are its containing system. It's an instrument of a purposeful system. You see, in the machine age, our problem was we saw the universe as a machine, and then we tried to explain purposeful parts. And it couldn't be done. You can't have parts that have choice of a system that has none. But now things are reversed. We see the larger system as having choice, and therefore the parts can. But if a system has no choice, it is an instrument of a system that does. So the machine is an instrument of a purposeful system. Its parts have no purposes. Now, suppose I move up one notch. I give the system a purpose, but its parts don't have any. What kind of a system have I got now? That's no longer a machine. You are such a system. You have purposes, but none of your parts do. Your heart does not have a purpose of its own, your lungs, your stomach, your pancreas, and so on. They serve your purposes, but they have no purpose of their own. They have no choice. You do. What do we call such a system? Organism. That's an organism. So the second level of the system is organism. The first is a machine. Now you can see what the third level of the system will be. It's a system which has a purpose, whose parts have purposes, and which is part of a larger system and has purposes of its own. What do you call that kind of a system? Organization. Exactly right. The Navy is such a system. It has purposes, its parts have purposes, and it's part of a society that has purposes of its own. Now, it's the recognition of the extreme importance of organization as the ultimate form of system, of which all other systems are parts, not reversed. Before, an organization was a part of a machine. Now a machine is a part of an organization. That completely new concepts and insights have been obtained. Take an organization. We have always known that an organization which has a purpose of its own, that organizations are affected by their environment. That's not a surprise. But it's only in the last couple decades that we become aware of the fact that the way an environment affects an organization depends on the way the organization affects the environment, that this is a feedback loop. As a result, we become conscious of a whole new class of problems. You see, this system out here, society, has purposes of its own, and it contains other systems which have purposes of their own. Now, what we've begun to see is systems out here objecting to the effect which organizations are having on them, organizing to obstruct and protest about what effect this is having on that, and forcing organizations to take into account the purposes of organizations external to them. That has come to be called the environmentalization problem. There are two major manifestations of that in the world today: environmentalization. The ecology movement is precisely such a movement, and the consumerist movement. They are both environmentalist problems. Why? They are problems which arise from pressure brought on organizations by organizations external to them, who believe they have a right to force this organization to serve their purposes more effectively. Why? Because the social system is seen as an instrument of the larger system of which it's a part, and also an instrument of its parts. Whereas in an organism, the parts are seen as instruments of the system, and the environment as an instrument of the system. You have a complete reversal. Here, the organization is an instrument of the whole of which it's a part, and its parts, they are not instruments of it. Now, the major problem which has emerged since World War II has arisen because of the following. We've always known that the behavior of the parts of a system affect the behavior of the whole, because that's what a system is. But it's only recently that we become aware that the way the parts affect the whole depends on how the whole affects the parts. And what we've begun to witness increasingly are parts of systems organizing within the system to protest about the way the system affects their purposes. This is probably the most prevalent and serious problem in the world today. It's called the humanization problem. Look at its manifestations. The third world problem is the humanization problem. These are parts of a system called the world. They say we are being messed up by the whole system, the world. And we want to change the world so our purposes are better served. The race problem, women's liberation, the generation gap, the alienation from work, all of these are manifestations of the same problem. The demand by the parts of purposeful systems that the systems of which they are a part better serve their purposes. Therefore, we have come to reconceptualize, to review what the responsibility of a system is. The management of a system, which was previously considered to be nothing but the direction of a system towards the attainment of its objectives, is now seen as the direction of a system so as to enable the larger systems of which it is a part to attain their objectives and to enable their parts to obtain their objectives. And this is a complete conversion in the concept of management, the implications of which we're going to explore later in the day. So we see management today as dealing with three classes of purpose. Purposes of the containing whole, society. Purposes of the system. In your case, this is the United States at the top, then the Navy, and then the individual member of the naval organization. And management has to deal with all three. Has to deal with the interaction of them. And even perhaps more critical is the fact that there are not compatible purposes within each level. That is, all the parts do not want the same thing. Not all parts of society want the same thing. So you have conflict between the three levels of purpose and within each level of purpose. And no wonder management begins to hold its head and say, my God, what in the world is happening in the world? Now being subjected to pressures that it never was before. How cope? And that's part of the problem that we're going to deal with here today. Well, so much for piece one. Let me take a little time now and give you a chance to have it, anything I've said up to now. I guess they would like you to use the microphone so it gets on record. If it's too hard for you to get to it, just speak up and I'll repeat your question. You can't think of anything you have a question about? That's hard to believe. All right, if you don't, then, although it's a few minutes early, can we take our break now? Is the stuff out there? It's not. Not till 45. Okay, well then we'll start the next piece then. What I want to do with you now is take a look at this organization, this third level of system, and see how our concept of it has undergone a transformation. Now, I'm going to use as an example the corporation or the enterprise, the business enterprise, rather than a military unit. I must apologize for doing this, but I've been working with corporations for all my life, and although I've done work in the military, I've never done it to the degree that I have in the corporation. The translation, I think, is fairly clear, so I'm going to deal with what I know about and ask your collaboration with me to help make the translation to the context you're most familiar with. I will try to suggest some of that as we go along. Do you have any idea when the Industrial Revolution began in the United States? You want to guess? No. It began in England in 1700 approximately. Didn't begin in this country till a little over 100 years ago. How come? Why were we 100 years after Europe? Well, Europe had been settled for centuries. They weren't doing any exploring and extending of their frontiers. We were. We were settling the land and making it suitable for agriculture. We were converting a wilderness into an agriculturally based economy. In 1900, 93% of all the people employed in the United States were employed on farms or farm industries. We were an agricultural nation. We didn't begin to industrialize until the land was settled. So it's roughly 1875, if you want a date, that we began to industrialize. Up until that time, industrial activity, or business activities in the United States was incredibly small. 80% of the businesses in the United States employed less than 20 people in 1875. The average space of a business activity was about the size of a two-car garage. So we were a completely non-industrialized nation 100 years ago, and we began to industrialize. Individuals and their families began to create businesses. And it was only a short time later that people began to recognize the need to train people to run a business. And so in 1881, the first business school in the world was created, and was created in the United States. It was created by a blacksmith. His name was Joseph Wharton, and the school he created is now known as the Wharton School. When the first business school was created, they had to develop a concept of what a business is. Okay? So the first essential question is, what is a business? Well, it's not surprising when an answer was given, because a business is a part of the world. What's the world? In 1875, what's the answer? A machine, right? Then what's a business? It's just a small machine. An enterprise is a machine. Not only is a business seen as a machine, but it's a machine that's seen to have been created by its God to do his work. Exactly. Now, who is the God? The owner. What was his work? Why did he create the business? To provide him with return or profit. Therefore, the machine, the business, had no purpose of its own. It was an instrument for the generation of profit to the benefit of the owner. But the owner was God, and he literally was. He was not constrained in any way by laws or regulations. He could employ who he wanted to, when he wanted to, for as long as he wanted to, in whatever environment he wanted to, and pay him whatever he wanted to. In his business, he was God, unconstrained. He was present and powerful. Now, why in the world would people agree to work under those conditions? Well, there are plenty of reasons. First, you hit the first one. One is that we were living in a time when there's no such thing as social welfare. And if you didn't work, you ran a very high risk of dying of destitution and poverty. You can see this today in the third world. You go to India, and don't ever make the mistake of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and driving around Calcutta, because there are trucks going around the city picking up the dead bodies that have accumulated overnight, and there'll be 2,000 to 5,000 every morning, destitute people with no means of support. Well, this country was in that condition at that time. Not quite as poor, but the same thing prevailed. Therefore, if your survival depends on your work, you'll work under any conditions. That was one thing. Secondly, the worker in the United States was not a highly educated person. Most of them were immigrants, and the average educational attainment was 3 years. They were just barely literate, so they didn't have a very high level of aspiration. They developed high aspirations for their children, but not for themselves. They saw themselves as sacrificing themselves for the welfare of the next generation. So they were willing to work in a demeaning context. There was an oversupply of labor because we had begun to mechanize agriculture, cutting back on the number of people required. And therefore, if you didn't want to work, that was no bother to the boss. He could find plenty of people on the street, and he literally could pick them up. Why? Because the work was unskilled, crude labor. No fancy machinery was required. Anybody could learn it very easily and very quickly. Well, there we were, in a world in which the factory simply became a machine, and the worker became a replaceable machine part. You used the worker until he was used up or defective, and then simply replaced them with another one. You had no obligation to the worker except compensation. In fact, the image that was used, if you read the literature at the time, is the worker is a slot machine, a working slot machine.
The iron law of wages back then?
Right. You put 1 quarter in, you get 1 unit. Put 2 quarters in, you get 2 units. 3 quarters, you get 3 units. Slot machine concept. The only relevant variable in the output of the machine part was compensation. That was the worker, the boss's button. So we developed a completely mechanistic concept. There are some beautiful quotations from the period. One expression that's still alive today that was very common is, the worker is nothing but a cog in the corporate machine. And that was literal, in the sense that that's exactly the way he was thought of. Now, this view of the organization prevailed up until about the time of World War I. In the period, the early 20s, a number of changes had begun to occur in society which made that view of the corporation untenable, of the company untenable. The first and most critical one was this: the American economy absolutely boomed. The growth that was possible was phenomenal. But a problem arose. If a company took all of the capital which it generated, all of its profits, and reinvested it in the company, it still couldn't grow as rapidly as was possible. The amount of growth that was possible exceeded the amount of growth that could be financed by the reinvestment of profit. Therefore, All these companies that wanted to grow were confronted with a problem, and the problem was this. Do I share the ownership in order to get more capital to invest, to make greater growth possible, or do I retain control? For example, this is exactly the problem of Henry Ford. It was a small company with a few people. He perceived that the growth of the automotive industry was virtually unlimited, but he couldn't finance it. What do you do? Well, what most of them did was they went public. They became public organizations. At that point, a number of transformations occur. Why? God disappears. You can't sit down and worship at the shrine of 250,000 gods who are shareholders. They're the owners out there. They're now impersonal, they're abstract, they're a spirit. They're not a presence that are there powerfully anymore. What we had happen in the early 20s in industry was exactly what happened in Western culture 1985 years ago, when God disappeared. It became an abstract spirit. The central problem was, how the devil do you communicate? Well, how did we solve the problem 1985 years ago? Communication with God. We created a social function, didn't we? And an institution to enable us to do so. What do we call it? Church. And we created a profession called the clergy. And they were a gifted profession because they, through revelation, knew the will of God and could convey it to us ordinary mortals. And we could use them as an intermediary to communicate to God. Exactly the same thing happened in the corporation. A clergy was created, which knew the will of the owners by revelation. Same way, communicated it to the workers, and presumably did it the other way around too. The clergy, of course, was what? Management. Management, as we understand today, emerged after World War I. When James Burnham, a professor at New York University in the 1920s, wrote a book describing this process called The Managerial Revolution, he was fired because of the radical nature of his assertion. He said, business is no longer controlled by the owners. Ownership has become an abstraction. It's controlled by managers who disguise their control under the skirts of a mythical force called the owner. Okay? So God disappears. Now some other things begin to happen. The corporations were making so much money that the tax receipts of the government were far in excess of what had been anticipated. And the government suddenly found itself with a treasury that was far larger than what it required. Now it had a choice. It could either reduce taxes, turn the money back, or it could find some way to use them. Now I hardly have to confront you with the question, what did it decide to do? Right? So it looked for good things to do. The first thing it decided is that education is a good thing. It's during this period that compulsory public education began and became the largest single form of social expenditure. By the period immediately following World War I, the average educational attainment of the worker had risen to 8 years. You're going to school 8 years. He's a much better educated worker. However, much more complicated machinery was in there and greater skill was required. And therefore, it wasn't as easy to get rid of a worker because you had to train his replacement. A great deal of knowledge was in him. And so he's no longer looked at as a replaceable machine part, but as a vital organ. And the company began to be looked at as an organism, not a machine. And we even gave it a name to reflect that. It came to be called a corporation. Corporation is a word derives from a Latin word, what? Corpus, right, which means a body. And legally, the corporation became an individual, an organism. Exactly the same thing. Now, an organism does not have profit as its purpose. Profit is to an organism what oxygen is to an organism. Profit is to an organization what oxygen is to an organism. Peter Drucker pointed this out. It's necessary for existence, but not the reason for it. It's the air that you breathe. You don't live to breathe, you breathe to live. Then what is the purpose of an organism? Well, the first purpose of every organism is what? Survival, right. It has its own purpose, which is to survive. And in order to survive, you must grow. Because contraction is the process of death. Growth is the process of life. So growth becomes the primary concentration of organizations during this period following World War I. Now, at the same time, these educated workers are beginning to raise unshirted hell about the conditions under which they're being forced to work. They're getting to know better. They don't have to work 66 hours a week under sweatshop conditions. And the men don't want their wives and children being exploited the way they were. They want a cleaner environment. When they begin to be looked at as an organism, then their health and safety become critical. And so we have the beginnings of legislation directed at improving the working conditions in order to preserve the health of the worker. And the worker himself began to organize to bring pressure on management to be concerned with health and safety. And he organized what we today know as the union. The primary purpose of unions when they were created was the establishment of working conditions that did not reduce the length of life of the people who were employed. That was their primary objective at the time. Now, one other thing happened. Part of the money the government was accumulating that was not used in education began to be used for the beginnings of what we today recognize as Social Security. The threat of economic destitution began to disappear. Not the threat of poverty, but the threat of extinction because of lack of employment began to disappear. So all these things contributed to a revision in the concept of a corporation. It's reflected in the language. It's absolutely beautiful. What do we begin to call the senior officer of a corporation or of a Navy or an Army or anything? He began to be called the what of the organization? The head. Biological analogy, straight through. One of the critical books on management that was written is called The Brain of the Firm. What are they referring to? Management is the brain. They talked about the communication system or the nervous system of the firm, even the metabolic system, the bringing in of materials, the production of waste, the putting out of final products. The biological analogy was used absolutely throughout. In the book, The Brain of the Firm, there's an analysis of the structure of the brain which shows that it has 5 levels of control, and then says it's exactly the way an organization should be structured in 5 levels, no more, no less, and each level should correspond to a level in the brain. So an organization, it should be nothing but a large brain. That's the organismic point of view. Okay, now what began to happen to that? World War II began to happen. This increasingly educated and economically secure workforce was to a very large extent drafted into the military service or volunteered. At precisely a time that the highest demand for productivity that had ever been placed was placed on American industry. How did it cope? Well, we all know. We had songs about it. We got Rosie the Riveter and Tilly the Toiler and young people into the plants and old people out of retirement. They used everybody they could to get into the plant, to turn out the weapons and the support material that were required for the waging of the war. Now, one curious thing about the military in World War II was it paid very, very little to those who were in the service. When I was inducted in 1942, my salary was $21 a month. We didn't need much more than that. But our families were well taken care of, our dependents. The system was set up so that dependents were reasonably well taken care of. They didn't have to live in abject poverty because the person on whom they depended had been pulled into the military. Therefore, those who went to work in World War II did not go to work primarily to increase income. They went out of a sense of patriotic duty. Now, when you want to get people who are working for a societal cause to work harder and more effectively, you cannot treat them as replaceable machine parts, nor can you treat them as purposeless organs. We discovered something new about the worker. He and she was a human being, and we had to begin to treat them as though they had purposes of their own. And this began to lead to a transformation. The average worker after World War II had had 12 years of education. A number of them had gone to college. The skills required had elevated with the increasing sophistication of mechanization and the introduction of automation, a subject that I want to come to in a little bit. And as a result of these movements, the emergence of the humanization problem that I just spoke about, the alienation from work, from managers who tried to continue to treat workers as though they were organisms or machine parts, became critical. The Department of Labor in the United States put out a book as recently as about 10, 12 years ago called America at Work, Work in America. It said that the most important single problem confronting this country was the unproductivity of labor deriving out of the alienation from work. People didn't like what they were doing, and therefore were not trying to do it well. And the reason for this is they didn't like what the nature of work was and the way they were treated at work. And this has led to a major revolution in the relationship between management and the employee that manifests itself in the third conversion, which is to begin to think of the enterprise not as an organism, but as an organization whose primary obligations are to its parts in a larger system of which it's a part. And I'm going to show you how that comes about, but I want to just take one moment to make one final point to round this off. Remember when a corporation was seen as a machine, it had no purpose of its own, but its purpose was to provide its owner with a profit, right? When it came to be looked at as an organism, profit was seen as oxygen. It's necessary for the existence, but not the reason for it. The organism had its own purposes, namely it wanted to live, and life meant growth. Now what happens when it begins to be looked at as an organization? Well, the same thing. Remember, when we went from machine to organism, profit became a means, and growth and survival became the end. Well, what happens here is growth and survival now become means to another end. And what's the end? The appropriate end for an organization, the objective of an organization, is not growth, but development. This is a concept which has gotten new meaning in recent times, very recent times. We're going to have to spend some time talking about because most people think that growth and development are the same thing, and they're not. They're absolutely different things. They're unrelated. You can grow without developing and develop without growing. A cemetery grows, but it doesn't develop. Trash heap grows, but it doesn't develop. Einstein and Verdi were developing at age 80, but they weren't growing. So we have to get straight about the meaning of development. It is central to the effective management of any organization, corporate, military, governmental, or whatnot, because it's in the difference between development and growth that we have the very core of the organizational revolution that's begun to take place. Now it's about time for the break. Let's take it.